So the first half of this presentation will be given by Rebecca, and then the second half will be given by Fiona. So with that, I'll mute myself, and then I'll just hand it over to you both.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have, I guess we have a little extra time, right? Because we have until 12.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, which is good because I think we have, there's a lot here. And obviously if we don't get through, every detail, you can always ask us questions afterwards, and you have the slides for reference. But, I think, I'll just sort of, I think if this makes sense for everybody, and Fiona, if this makes sense for you too, I think that, with the webinar, I'll sort of pause I don't think I need to sort of wait till the end of my part, but I can, sort of pause every few slides to see if there are questions, just because I know that this is like pretty nitty gritty.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So, so today we are covering a lot of ground in terms of non-Magi Medicaid and other non-Magi programs. And so, these are, the individuals who, generally we're talking about people who are over 65, blind, or have a disability, and are still dealing with the pre-ACA methodology, and very complicated methodology for Medicaid eligibility, but also talking about a number of different ways that people can access Medicaid, because of their status. And so, starting, because we're talking about non-Magi, we're starting with what is Magi. So modified adjusted gross income is based on tax law, and it is the way that under the ACA, Medicaid eligibility is determined for a number of populations of Medicaid. And so, and also, of course, all of the other programs under the Affordable Care Act. And so, okay, yes, great, sorry. No, you're good. Yeah, okay. So who gets non-Magi budgeting? Because basically there's, a whole bunch of people who are being looked at under Magi budgeting in this whole new way. And, to be, extremely generalized, if you are talking to a client who is under 65 and does not have a disability, they are likely Magi budgeted. And you're going to obviously ask more questions to figure it out. But who do we know is non-Magi budgeted? So it's people who are categorically eligible for Medicaid, such as those who are on SSI, kids in foster care, people who are getting public assistance, age, over 65, we said, based on being blind or disabled, when you're eligible for long-term care services, and I'm not going to read through the whole list, but what I often ask people, just to sort of understand, kind of the first few questions, is like, if you're over 65, we know that you're non-Magi, and are you receiving a cash benefit? That I think just covers a lot of individuals who are non-Magi, because they're getting SSI, they're getting public assistance, and so those are many of the people who are non-Magi. And you can go to the next slide. Okay. Okay. This is really important. There are people who can choose Magi or non-Magi. It's not that many people, but it is some individuals, and it's important to know, because we actually see the local district messing this up a lot. And so you really want to, if somebody comes to you and they have gotten and they've gotten a discontinuance, or or a spend down notice, it could be wrong. It could be that it's a person who's not being given the most favorable budgeting. And, and that's the most important thing to remember, that if you're eligible for both, you're entitled to the most favorable budgeting. And so, generally, if you are certified disabled, you're going to be non-Magi. But if you, for example, are on SSD, but you're in your 2-year waiting period and you haven't yet started getting Medicare, then you can choose Magi. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be the preferable budget for you. And then the big one is also parent, caretaker, relatives, because Medicare is usually the big one in terms of if you're getting Medicare, it means you're over 65 or you're certified disabled and you are non-Magi. But being a parent or caretaker relative of a child who's in your household, that trumps everything, and so you can still choose Magi, and then also disabled kids unless they're in a waiver program. Okay, so here is a case example. So John is 57 years old. He gets Social Security disability of $1,650 per month. He has Medicare coverage. He's unmarried and lives with his 15-year-old daughter. So how should he be budgeted? And so we see sort of a lot of different clues in the of what his situation is, here in the description. He's getting SSD. We know he's certified disabled. He's getting Medicare, but he has a daughter. And then let's look at his income amount and figure out what is preferable for him. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so he's entitled to both. He's entitled to non-Magi because he's certified disabled. With non-Magi budgeting, he's considered a household of one. Now, we have some slides later on sort of the household stuff. We're not going in great detail today over figuring out the details of people's households, but this is just sort of making the point that with non-Magi budgeting, you have lower income limits, and so he's at an $875 per month income limit. But with Magi budgeting, he's looking at a limit for a 2-person household of almost $2,000. And so in his case, he's entitled to choose either, and he is going to do much better with Magi budgeting. I think a good rule of thumb in situations where you're figuring out if somebody is eligible for which is preferable when someone is eligible for most is like, if it's just about income, they're generally going to do better with Magi budgeting. Magi does not have disregards in the same way that non-Magi does. So a case example I could think of where somebody might do better with non-Magi would be, for example, if they had a significant amount of earned income, of work income, which is treated very favorably. Less than half of it is counted in non-Magi budgeting. And so, that might be an example where non-Magi budgeting is preferable, but in many cases, for those who can choose, Magi budgeting is going to be preferable. Okay. So, as we've, said, this is budgeting that's unchanged by the ACA. This is the budgeting that we've been, doing for years and years. And it's, following these, pre-ACA, unfortunately pretty complicated budgeting, methodologies. So, this is, I think, a real fundamental unfairness of the Medicaid program is that, which really is, very difficult for people a lot of times when they, become disabled or turn 65, that even though there are different routes to Medicaid coverage, that the income limits are much lower. They sort of creep up a little bit every single year, but they are significantly lower. We use what's called SSI related budgeting. You can still use a spend down. That's one important thing to note, is you can't use spend down with Magi budgeting. It's not, we've had some unfortunate, situations where somebody is like just over the Magi limit, but no, you can't just spend down from the Magi limit. The Medicaid buy-in for working people with disabilities is still an option. I think Fiona's going to talk about that. And Medicare savings programs remain the same, really as they were before, in terms of the eligibility standards and applying, and as they were before the ACA. I had said I was going to pause every few slides, and I apparently lied. So why don't I pause there and see if anybody has questions.
Great. I'm taking a look to see if there are any hands raised or any questions in the questions tab. Okay. Looks like there are no questions yet.
Okay, great. So I will move along. Okay. So as I said, the income limits for SSI related budgeting, for non-Magi budgeting, are lower than for Magi and Magi-like. There are really complicated rules around household size, which really depend on the status of different people in the household. I'll talk about that more afterwards. There are, as we said, income disregards that are available. And some of the big ones are the unearned income disregard, which is a $20 disregard that applies to most everybody, because so many people have unearned income who are on this kind of budgeting. And the big one is there is a resource test, and so that is another real downside of non-Magi budgeting, and something that also when somebody turns 65 or becomes certified disabled can negatively impact them if they don't realize that that they're starting to have a resource test, because of course if they haven't had one all along, there's it really it does defy logic that suddenly you're having to deal with this limitation that you haven't had to deal with before. And so the current levels are the current resource limit levels are here. Again, they kind of creep up a little bit every year, but do make a big difference for people in terms of budgeting. Okay, so as I said, the household size is really very complicated, and we're not, and I'm not going to go into kind of all of the very specific examples of how household size is done, because it's the type of thing that I don't think anyone really needs to have 100% memorized off the top of their heads. It's the type of thing that we're very happy to consult on these cases if you are if you're trying to figure out both the best budgeting for a family and and for what and what works for that for that individual household, because if you've looked at some of the charts, this is gone through in a lot of detail in the Medicaid reference guide. There are lots of different rules for the age of the different individuals, the disability status of each individual. There are different rules for when you have two spouses in a household, when one is disabled, when both are disabled, when there's a disabled child in the household, when there's both a disabled and a non-disabled child in the household. And so and so we're not going into all of it here, but suffice it to say that where you have, a multi-person household with the possibility of non-Magi budgeting, it's something that, we can certainly, kind of help you work through, and, and there's just going to be a lot of factors, some of you may have heard of the concepts of allocation and deeming. It's really like, it's like the most advanced budgeting of, figuring out how budgeting households work. One thing always to remember, though, is that SSI related children are budgeted as a household of one, using their income and deemed income from their parents. And people who are actually receiving SSI or public assistance are not counted in the Medicaid household size, and their income doesn't count. So that's just sort of some examples of why it is like such a case-by-case situation and so complicated to do this. And the other thing is, as you're looking at MSP budgeting, that the household is always two when you have a married couple. Okay, so just talking about income. So it's all earned income. Earned income is generally income from work. Unearned income, which comes in different forms, but largely we're talking about income from benefits, Social Security, other income, and there are deductions and disregards. There's a long list of them in the MARG, but many of them are pretty uncommon. Really the big ones are the big ones are the unearned income disregard, the earned income disregard, where it's minus $65 and then half of the remainder. So it's really a very significant disregard. And then, there are also things like other health insurance premiums you're paying and things like that are disregarded. Generally, income is counted in the month received. It's supposed to be prorated if it's received on a different, schedule. This is something that can be very complicated in figuring out income when income in fact is not regular. And this is one of the reasons that 12-month continuous coverage in under Magi budgeting is just which New York applied for a waiver for in under the ACA, is just like such an excellent thing, because we all know that in our in particular in like low income clients' lives, there's often just lots of different things that happen financially. Income is sporadic or inconsistent. It's hard to predict. People don't know that they're making overtime, et cetera, and so the difficulty of sort of dealing with income that is inconsistent is just made much easier with the 12-month continuous coverage rules. Okay, I'm going to pause again to see if there are questions.
No questions yet.
Okay. Okay, so so I actually mentioned most of this. So these are some of the most common SSI related disregards, and I know that Fiona is going to touch more on supplemental needs trust, but income deposited into a supplemental needs trust, if it's if you go through the whole process of having it set up correctly and approved by your local district, then that is not going to be counted. That is a big way that some people are able to be eligible for Medicaid when they are over the income limit. Okay, so back to talking a little bit about resources. So what is a resource? It's your cash that is available or countable, and it's basically whatever else you have that is convertible into cash. And so an income that you that you received previously, it's income in the month it was received, and then if you still have it, it becomes a resource. And so you know, obviously the easiest to are things like bank accounts to understand. But really any way in which you have your money, CDs, the stocks, IRAs, etc. This is all considered your money and or your resources. And generally, the amount of cash that's counted is what you could receive from the resource the amount of cash you could receive from it. So your life insurance would be like the value if it were cashed out. Your property is the equity in your property, not counting the your primary residence. And for retirement accounts, it takes into account the value that it would be if it got cashed out, but taking into account, obviously, a lot of times there are significant penalties when you cash out retirement accounts before a particular age. So it takes into account what those penalties would be. And there is a higher income limit for the Medicaid buy-in for working people with disabilities. I'm sorry, resource limit. Okay. And so there are just some and so just a few additional notes about resources. There isn't, so as I said, the home, if you own the home that you live in, it is not counted as a resource. But if you want long-term care, which is either nursing home or community-based, then there's a limit for home equity, and if it's above that limit, then that is counted against you, resource-wise. In order to reduce your countable resources, you can make irrevocable prepaid funeral arrangements. You can also make a burial fund. If you have an annuity that is in payout status, then that is something that cannot count as a resource. Although the important thing here is that the payouts that you're then getting, like on a regular basis, often a monthly basis, those count as income. So this can sometimes be a confusing thing for people where it's like, oh great, it doesn't count as this doesn't count as a resource anymore, but you've just upped your monthly income. There are a lot of really complicated rules for business deductions, for income producing property. These are very case by case specific specific situations. And so I would say if somebody really has a complicated resource situation, we're always happy to consult on those. It's hard to sort of describe every possible situation because there are a lot of them. Okay. Fiona, is this our transition point? I think it is.
Yes, it is our transition. Will we pause just in case there's any questions?
Or let me take a look. No questions yet.
Okay, excellent. I will just dive in. Hi, everybody. I'm Fiona Wolf from Empire Justice Centre. In the second half of this presentation is going to cover, okay, what do you do with that excess income if you're over the limits that Rebecca had been explaining in the prior slides. This is just a little roadmap of the topics we're going to cover. Options are spend down, transferring assets, supplemental needs trusts, the Medicaid buy-in for working people with disabilities, that was referred to earlier as well, Medicare savings programs, spousal refusal, and then options for MLTC enrollees, spousal budget, and housing disregard. So we're going to be covering a lot. I'll start with spend down. So what is spend down? Anyone with non-Magi budgeting can spend down their excess income or resources to those applicable limits. To qualify for a spend down, you must either pay or incur medical bills which meet or exceed your spend down obligation, or you have the option of paying in or prepaying the amount of your monthly spend down. You have to meet the amount each month in order to activate Medicaid coverage, and clients are going to need 6 months worth of spend down to activate inpatient hospital coverage. Next slide. So bills need to be incurred, but they don't necessarily need to be paid. Medicaid applicants can use bills from prior months to meet future spend down. The options are to take paid bills from the past 3 months plus a month of application, or use unpaid bills. And there's no time limit there if those are still viable. So what sort of bills are we talking about? Health insurance deductibles and co-payments would be examples. Medically necessary expenses that are not covered by Medicaid. For example, chiropractors or providers that just don't accept Medicaid. Really any medical expenses. Money that's been paid by other programs can also count towards spend down, highlighted there EPIC or the AIDS Drug Assistance Program. And remember that you can get deemed into extra help by meeting spend down for just 1 month. Supplemental needs trust can also be an option to meet spend down. We'll cover that later, further on these slides. And just a little note that for services that are requiring prior approval, you'd be limited to what is actually approved as medically necessary. You'd only be able to use that portion to meet spend down. Okay, next slide. So some specifics about meeting spend down or documenting spend down during COVID. If you meet your monthly spend down to activate Medicaid, HRA has confirmed that they will grant 6 months of coverage in the following circumstances. The first is if you meet your spend down in March, April, May, June, July, August, September, or October. The second is if you are someone who's been trying to meet your spend down in either March, April, May, June, July, August, September, or October, but have been unable to. For example, you've been unable to get bills from your providers because of the public health emergency, or you've been unable to fax or otherwise submit your bills to HRA, or HRA is not processing the bills or payments. If that's the case, then you have to call the Medicaid Surplus Helpline, I put the number on there, and provide the following information: name, CIN, phone number. If you're submitting a bill, the name of the provider, the date of the service and the amount of the bill. And if you're trying to submit a payment, then it would be the amount of the payment. Just a sort of heads up, don't have anybody leave, tell people not to leave any credit card information or attempt to make a payment by credit card on that voicemail. And you can certainly let your clients know that they will only receive a call back from HRA if additional information is needed. Now, that's obviously HRA specific. Some local districts have policies in place for a similar extension here if the recipient meets their spend down during the public health emergency for 1 month, or they've been trying to submit documents. But you really need to direct people to check first with the LDSS office for details of what their precise details of what they need and will require. I would also counsel people to Or if they're paying their spend down to their MLTC plans, contact their plan as soon as possible. And also tell them to save receipts. Keep a list of the monthly amount. Just have people be ready to provide documentation at a later date, because as we all know and hope, this public health emergency is going to end at some point, but there is going to be a lot of paperwork required. So just put people in the best possible position if they're going to need to deal with that at a future date. Okay, next slide. So transfer of assets, that can be an option for people who are trying to deal with some excess income or resources. There's no penalty for transfer of assets made prior to an application. But of course, a transfer of assets can disqualify someone for receiving Medicaid for institutional care within 5 years of the transfer. Medicaid is going to check everything. They're going to check all past transfers of assets. They're going to review all financial records, and they're going to look to see if there's any assets that have been transferred, either given away or sold for less than fair market value. And if they find something, then a transfer penalty is going to be applied, and that will be calculated by dividing the total amount by the monthly regional nursing home costs. So this can have, the transfer penalty can be a really big deal for our clients who are moving into nursing homes. So 5 years, it's a long look back period. There are some exceptions. I've listed a few out there: transferring home to a spouse, to a disabled child under 21 who resided there and provide care. You can transfer assets to an SNT if you're under 65. There could be a compensation for the transfer. It might be for fair market value or for some other compensation that would count. And there's also a hardship exception. Now, a big star there at the bottom of the page. This is, the transfer of assets. This is Medicaid for primary or acute care. There are big changes for transfer of assets as far as it relates to community long-term care coverage. So let's move on to look at that now. I'll do a quick pause just to see if there's any questions on those first sections.
Look. No questions so far.
Okay, excellent. And if I forget to pause, just interrupt me. We'll have time for questions at the end as well.
No problem.
Let's look at this new look back penalty. So up until now, nursing home care was the only Medicaid service with the look back and transfer penalty. And that is going to stay. That look back for institutional Medicaid remains at 5 years. But as a result of the MRT, we are now facing a new look back period of 2.5 years or 30 months for anyone who's applying for HCBS, for anyone who's applying for home and community-based services. This is a really big change. It's going to catch anyone looking for home health care, adult daycare, personal care services, including CDPAS, assisted living. DOH can actually designate other groups by regulations to add to the list. It's also going to include, private duty nursing, MLTC in the community. This is big. This is a really big change. The new look back does not apply to waiver programs or for primary or acute care, but it's going to catch just about everything else. So next slide. That's the section there of the law, if anybody wants to look at it in detail. So what does this mean? What does this new look back penalty mean? Applicants who are applying for Medicaid after April 1st, 2021, and it was initially going to be October 1st of this year, and then it was pushed back to January 1st. But we're now looking at applicants applying April 1st, 2021. In order for them to obtain any community-based long-term care services, there will be a look back that will eventually be the full 30 months. The look back will be for transfers made on or after October 1st, 2020. And the look back is going to be phased in. So for those applicants that will be filing in April of next year, they're going to have to include 6 months of financial records beginning October 1st. And then applicants filing in May are going to have to include 7 months of records back to October 1st, and so on, until we get to those people who will be supplying the full 30 months of records. There's lots of unknowns here, a heck of a lot of unknowns. In fact, we've got a link there to a very detailed information that's been produced by NILAG already, and a full training that they did just on this new look back penalty. But a takeaway for everybody is, if you're working with somebody and they have transferred assets after October 1st of this year, and they're going to be looking for home care services, they now have extra time. They now have until April 1st, 2021 to submit an application seeking eligibility for any of these home care services with no look back or transfer penalty. So we don't know if that date is going to get pushed back even further. Again, who knows? But that's where things stand now. This will kick in April 1st of next year. And as I said, lots of unknowns, lots of big questions. You know, one would be whether or not pooled income trusts are still going to be permitted once the look back starts. We're keeping an eye on this, and you know, you can expect sort of future policy updates going forward as we find out more. And a big concern that really everybody seems to have is the inevitable delays that are going to kick in once this look back review starts, whether it is in April or whether it is further down the line. Whenever it is, there's just going to be a massive paper load and crunch as these applications have to be processed. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, next slide. So supplemental needs trusts, we've touched on this a few times, it's been mentioned already. A supplemental needs trust will enable a person with a disability to maintain their eligibility for benefits, primarily Medicaid. It's a way to shield income, lets them deposit excess income directly into the trust. It's only for people with disabilities, like I said, including those that are over 65. The trust, the money that's held in the trust, can then be used to pay third parties for shelter, food, clothing, recurring bills. So rent, utility bills. Some trusts will pay credit cards as long as there's no cash withdrawals. Really, it's anything that's used for the benefit of the person. It can't be for anyone else's benefit. It has to be for their benefit. However, there can be no direct payments to the beneficiary from the funds. And the trust itself must be irrevocable. If it could be dissolved, if that money could somehow come back to the beneficiary, then it would count as an available asset. So this money that's in the trust wouldn't be shielded in any way. There are lots of rules about supplemental needs trust, and they're going to depend on things like whose money was used to establish, whether it's a self-settled or a third-party trust, and the age of the beneficiary. For example, if a person's over 65, then they can only use pooled trusts. And the type of public benefits that a person's receiving, because disbursements are going to be treated differently. Next slide. Pooled income trust must be established by a non-profit that pools the deposits of multiple beneficiaries together. We've included there a list of pooled trusts in New York that's maintained by Health Access. The trusts are all going to have different costs. There could be startup costs or monthly fees, and it's going to vary trust to trust. So there's a lot of information that somebody who is thinking about using a trust would have to consider as to which is the best option for them. A little note there, the remainder stays with the trust upon death. So either the state Medicaid program must be the primary remainderment, so the money would go to the state, or if it's a pooled trust, that can be a non-profit organisation. But the thing to remember is the money is not coming back to the beneficiary. Anything left over on their death is going to stay with the trust. Next slide. Okay, so people over 65 must obtain a disability determination if they don't already have one. That requires several forms to be submitted to the local district along with the trust paperwork. There's that link there is to an article with lots of information about the setup of a trust and what documentation you would need to be submitting in order to get it set up. And a big consideration for our clients is how much should they be contributing? I mean, obviously they have to look at the spend down amount, how much are they needing, how much excess are they needing to take care of? But they may want to be contributing slightly less than the spend down. You've got to think about the bills that they're going to need to pay every month. If their monthly bills are low, then they could have genuine concerns about accumulating a balance in the trust that might never actually have an opportunity to be paid out during their lifetime on their expenses. So just it's a very complex, like a lot of the things that Rebecca was touching on in her part of the presentation. I mean, you could have an entire training. We have had entire trainings. There are trainings on pooled trusts. It's a complicated issue. If anybody is looking to establish one or comes to you with questions, you're going to have to do a lot of digging. You're probably going to be referring them on to someone who does this and somebody who can provide detailed case-by-case specific information, because there's a lot of considerations as to what's right for each person. Okay, next slide. So the Medicaid buy-in for working people with disabilities. And we've had referenced this a couple of times already as an option that allows people with disabilities to keep their benefits, meet their medical needs, and to continue working. It lets people qualify for full Medicaid benefit without a spend down at higher incomes than they would otherwise be able to have. Lets people work without fear of losing their essential medical benefits. So it's a really great program, and one that we want to make sure that we are directing people to and channeling them into if it's appropriate for their circumstances. In order to qualify, a person must be certified disabled, aged between 60 and 64, and they need to be working. Now, there's no minimum number of hours. There's no minimum requirement. The income threshold is higher than those income thresholds that you're looking at for non-Magi, a lot higher. It's 250% of the FPL, and that's after income disregards have been applied. So 250% for a household of one is $2,659. And for a household of two, that's $3,592. So that really is significantly higher than the charts that we were looking at earlier on. There are also much more generous resource disregards. Retirement accounts are excluded, and you have a $20,000 limit for a single person and $30,000 resource limit for couples. There are other disregards: homestead, vehicle, life insurance with a value of $1,500 or less. So bear those in mind as well. It can also reimburse the cost of Part B premiums if somebody is not eligible for MSP enrollment. And a link there to just more information about the buy-in program generally. Next page. Okay, some more eligibility factors to consider if you're screening somebody for the buy-in. As I mentioned on the previous slide, there's no minimum number of working hours. There's also no substantial gainful activity requirement. There's no minimum wage requirement, but the person must be disabled or potentially disabled and can have their disability determined by the state disability review team, but they don't necessarily need to be receiving SSD. They can also be on the waiting period for Medicare or receiving Medicare. There is supposed to be a premium for those whose income falls within that 150 to 250% of the poverty level. But there's a moratorium on these premiums, and that has been in place for a little while. I've got a link there to the gist that sets that out. Next slide. And there are two eligibility groups. There's the basic coverage, the regular, that we've really looked at already. And then there's also the medical improvement group. And this allows for coverage to continue when a person is still considered disabled or impaired, but is also considered to be medically improving. And if they fall within that second medical improvement group, then they do have to work a minimum of 40 hours a month, but they can request a grace period as well. And we've got a link there for more information in a directive. Okay, next slide. So turning now to the Medicare savings programs. These are obviously the Medicaid administered programs for people on Medicare, helps them qualify to afford Medicare. And these programs, the three different programs, the QIMBY, SLIMBY, and QI, all pay for Part B monthly premium. They're all based on income. QIMBY is the most comprehensive. That's for those whose income is at or below 100% FPL. If somebody qualifies for QIMBY, they're going to have their Part A, Part B premiums, deductibles, and co-pays. And QIMBY coverage is not retroactive. QIMBY program benefits will begin the month after the month in which somebody is found eligible. Now, for SLIMBY and QI, you can have retroactive coverage. They provide coverage for 3 months prior to the month of application, as long as the person was eligible during those months. However, another caveat, QI retroactive coverage can only be provided within the current calendar year. So if you apply in January, you basically get no retroactive coverage under QI. QIMBY and SLIMBY recipients can also receive Medicaid. You apply for the MSP programs through the local Medicaid office or via SSA Extra Help application. MSP removes Part B late enrollment penalties or the waiting period to enroll, so that's a great thing to bear in mind. And a note there, you can't spend down to the MSP income levels, but it is possible to use a supplemental needs trust to get down to those levels. I think I already mentioned, QIMBY is at or below 100%, SLIMBY is between 100 and 120%, and a QI, a qualifying individual, between 120 and 135% FPL. Okay, that was very fast on the Medicare savings programs. I hope everybody understands everything about them now. Next slide. Okay, spousal refusal. Oh, sorry, were you talking there, Catherine? Should I pause?
Yeah, Fiona, it's Marge Gustus. I have a question for you. Can you go back to the MSP slide for just a minute, please?
We can go back. Go for it. If I push the question till the end, I will do, but go for it.
I didn't hear what you just said. You were breaking up a little.
Yep, let's hear the question.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right, I wanted you to repeat something. So coverage under MSP starts in the following month of the month that you were determined eligible for MSP. So if I'm determined eligible for MSP in April, I would get my first payment in May?
Yeah, QMB benefits begin the month after the month in which you're found eligible.
Just like Social Security, you really don't get it. You get it for the next month. I haven't tasted this.
No retroactive with Quimby. But Slimby and QI, yes, you can get retroactive.
Okay. All right, thank you.
I know, so many acronyms, and I think I blew through that slide quite quickly. We're trying to cover a lot of topics.
No problem. You may have answered a problem for me because I'm not getting a response from DSS. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, we'll move on to spousal refusal. So spousal refusal is going to be very important when a spouse's income is going to be a barrier to enroll in Medicaid. If that's the case, then the spouse can sign a refusal form that's submitted to either the local district office or to HRA. And that's a statement. It's a statement that he or she cannot contribute towards the applicant's medical expenses and cannot support them financially. Once spousal refusal is activated, the spouse's income and resources will not be counted, and the applicant will be counted as a household of one for budgeting. This can be used to access Medicaid and the and the Medicare savings programs. Now, your spouse that's completing the form, your refusing spouse, cannot have Medicaid themselves. And a big point to note is that the refusing spouse is still a legally responsible person, and they could potentially be sued. But it is a commonly used tool in order to get over a barrier to enrolling in Medicaid. And it also seems like we very narrowly missed this protection being repealed this year by the Medicaid redesign team. Seems like it's something that's up for repealing potentially every year, but it was very close. Right, moving on now to options for somebody who is in managed long-term care. So MLTC options. There is the MLTC housing allowance, which is an income disregard that's available specifically to individuals who are being discharged into the community from either a nursing home or an adult home. Now, they can't already be enrolled in MLTC. So this is for new applicants, for new enrollees. And if somebody is married, you can't use both the spousal impoverishment protections and the housing disregard. You must choose one or the other. So a lot of it's going to come down to what's best in a particular circumstances for your client based on their finances, their resources. So let's look next slide. A little bit more about the housing allowance eligibility. As I said, they need to have had a nursing home or an adult home stay. If it's a nursing home, it has to be in a stay for at least 30 days prior to the day of discharge, and Medicaid made a payment towards that nursing home stay. If we're looking at somebody who's been in an adult home, it has to be an adult home stay prior to discharge, and they have to have been on Medicaid while in the adult home. And they have to have a housing expense. A housing expense can be, mortgage, rent, room and board, co-op fees, anything that's directly related to the housing. And it's possible for the applicant to attest to the amount. They don't need to provide documentation to support. Next slide. This is just a table that sets out the housing allowance deduction for each of the regions. As you can see, it's not very high. It's based on set amounts, regardless of a person's actual housing expenses. And you can see there the region that I'm in, the Rochester region, $444. Goodness, you can't rent much for $444 a month, that's for sure. But these figures, they all come from Housing and Urban Development, fair market rent amounts that are put out, and then from that figure, 30% of the Medicaid income level for a household of one is used. So they'll probably go up slightly year to year, but they're still going to be fairly nominal. But still an important tool to let people take advantage of any and all deductions that they can. Okay, next slide. Again, still looking at our options for MLTC, there is spousal impoverishment budgeting. It's an option for married couples where one spouse is in managed long-term care. It can also be used when a spouse is in a waiver program or a skilled nursing facility. An MLTC applicant who has a community spouse can shelter income up to $3,216 a month of joint income, personal needs allowance, which lets the MLTC applicant retain $409 a month for personal needs, and health insurance premiums. Get a typo in there. We say deduce the cost. So we can deduct the cost of health insurance premiums. Got to deduce them first, then you can deduct them. And it lets an applicant shelter assets up to $74,820. We've included a link there to the GIS with the 2020 Medicaid levels and a few other updates. This slide, my goodness, the terminology used in spousal impoverishment budgeting, can barely say the title, let alone all these acronyms. Handy reference sheet here. Community spouse, that's a spouse who does not need MLTC. The MLTC spouse, you'll still sometimes see a person referred to as institutionalized spouse. That's just kind of an old leftover term from when this was only for use with people in nursing homes. So your MLTC spouse is obviously the person who needs the MLTC. We have minimum monthly maintenance needs allowance. I just want to point out a mistake there. I didn't update the figure. The maximum income that the community spouse can keep is actually now $3,216. That's an old figure there, apologies. Community spouse monthly income allowance, the amount the MLTC spouse can shift over to the community spouse to bring the community spouse's income up to that minimum monthly maintenance needs allowance. And then the personal needs allowance, the PNA, the amount that the MLTC spouse can keep. Again, I've got an old figure in there. It's now $409 per month. But those figures are correctly set out on the slide before. So use the right ones, not the wrong ones. My bad. Okay, next slide. So let's look at a little case scenario, case example. And I'll butcher each and every acronym as we come across it. So we get Morgan and Chris are a married couple. Both are on Social Security disability and both receive Medicare. Morgan needs community-based long-term care, so she's going to be our MLTC spouse. Morgan applies for Medicaid. Got a little table there setting out their income. You can see $2,000 and $1,500, and then their Medicare Part B premiums. So next slide. First step is to determine the maximum community spouse monthly income allowance. How do you get that? Well, you have to start by determining the community spouse's net income. Chris, our community spouse in this little scenario, income is the Social Security disability at $1,500, less the Part B deduction. So Chris's net income, $1,355.40. So you're going to subtract Chris's net income from the minimum monthly maintenance needs allowance. So we know that the MMMNA is $3,216. So take away Chris's net income, and that leaves the community spouse monthly income allowance for Chris of $1,860.60. So let's turn to the next slide and see how we apply that along with the personal needs allowance. So Morgan and Chris are going to be lucky. They're going to get to keep all of their income. Chris gets less than the maximum community spouse monthly income allowance because the couple's income when put together doesn't take them over the limits. They're going to have no spend down, but they could potentially have a spend down if their income were higher in this scenario. So you can see the little table where we've put out the numbers again, showing that the amount that can be transferred to Chris and lets them get to that excess income / spend down of 0. So converting to spousal impoverishment budgeting. A warning, enrolling in managed long-term care doesn't automatically change budgeting. As soon as somebody is enrolling in MLTC, you have to submit to DOH a request for spousal impoverishment assessment form. That's going to have to go to the local district or to HRA. Now, HRA and some other counties prefer applicants to go through the MLTC plan. So they want the MLTC plan and not the member to be submitting this request. So just bear that in mind. And we have a link there to that DOH request for spousal impoverishment assessment form on the page. And that was a very quick run through of options for those in MLTC. Final slide here is some COVID updates. We thought we would just put in a few things that may be relevant. Again, this is pretty broad and we could probably do a lot more on COVID updates, but I know we've gone through a heck of a lot of information. The first link there on the slide is a DOH link to Medicaid coverage through your local Department of Social Services during the coronavirus emergency. That's kept, fairly up to date and has a lot of information about applying for and maintaining coverage. As I mentioned during the policy updates today, we have, during the public health emergency, everyone with Medicaid coverage on or after March 18th is going to keep their coverage unless they cancel it or move out of New York State during the emergency. But as I was saying earlier, just be ready to educate and advocate for your clients, particularly outside the city. As I said, we've been hearing about people getting notices from their county that they're losing coverage. So you really need to sort of address this on a case-by-case basis, and hopefully we will get an updated gist that takes us past that June 2020. Something solid that we can present to people when we're telling them that they ought not to be dropping people's coverage. We've had some questions come in, people asking us specifically about their stimulus checks and whether or not that counts as income for purposes of Medicaid eligibility. For Magi-based determinations, the stimulus payments were not taxable income, so not countable for anyone who's Magi. For non-Magi determinations, again, the payments are not countable, the stimulus payments are not countable as income, and they're an exempt resource, but only for 12 months. So after 12-month period, any portion of a stimulus payment that somebody is still holding, that will become a countable resource. Spend down, on how to sort of document and meet and keep track of your spend down during COVID. I've got see slide 5 there. That was my slide number 5, and then it got combined. So it's no longer slide number 5, but we did have a whole slide on spend down during COVID. So we just refer back to the information that we covered there. And yeah, COVID updates are changing all the time. So it's just something that we really have to kind of, always keep an eye on and be on top of and make sure that we are giving our clients the most up-to-date information, because as we know, they're not always getting it from DOH, and they're certainly not getting it from the local district offices either. So keep on it, keep doing what you're doing. And that's the end of my info.
Thank you so much, Fiona. And thank you, Rebecca. We have time for questions, so feel free to ask any questions regarding the training today.
Before anyone jumps in with any questions, I just wanted to give an update unrelated to this training. As some of you might have noticed, Amanda Gallipo is not on our chat monthly call today and is not doing the training, even though she would normally be your main point of contact here at Empire Justice Centre. I think a lot of people probably already know, but for those that don't, Amanda is still with Empire Justice, but she's no longer directly in our chat and our health team. She's transitioned into an exciting new role, actually managing a local Monroe County project, which is a sort of tax and health project hybrid. It's really exciting for her. So she's still here, but she won't be on any chat meetings going forward. But we're lucky that we still get to work with her in the background. And I know that a lot of you have worked with Amanda for a long time. So just in case you wondered why you weren't hearing her voice and you were getting badgered by me instead.
Thanks, Fiona, for providing that update. We will miss Amanda, but I'm glad that she has a great, exciting role now. So I'm still checking for questions, but on the follow-up email, I will provide Fiona and Rebecca's emails in case any of you have questions after you process all this information. So I'll just give everyone one more minute just in case you are typing in a question or you're trying to think of a question, looking through the PowerPoint. Okay. All right. Well, everyone, first I want to say thank you to Fiona and Rebecca for all this information. Again, as I stated, I will provide their contact information in case any questions come up. But with that, I will conclude today's monthly meeting. Thank you all for joining us. Please have a great day. And as always, we are available if there are any questions. Thank you all.
Good.
Take care.
Thank you.
Good. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.